Welcome to a wonderful journey of nostalgia down memory lane. My name is Dennis Mike Morrison, and I will be your guide on this very special journey into Bridgeport, Michigan's past. So I'll be back in just a moment, and in the meantime, enjoy this great old song. Wasn't that pretty? Kind of reminds me of the turn of the century. Actually, the song is from ABC TV Dark Shadows from 1966. I grew up in Bridgeport, Michigan in the mid to late 1960s. My family lived in a house that my dad and granddad built at 4233 Shreve Drive. Bridgeport was a truly special place back then, and I became fascinated by its history. In fact, so much so that I started a small newspaper at Bridgeport Junior High School. And in that paper, I wrote a number of articles about Bridgeport's past. Now, there was a township newspaper then that perhaps some of you might remember. It was called the Bridgeport Future and later became Future Views. They also published those articles. Then in 1969, when the Bridgeport Future turned 1 year old, the editor and staff came to me and asked me to write their complete anniversary edition as a history of Bridgeport. That paper came out in August of 1969. And the following is based on that and a series of articles I did over the following year and a half for them. I hope you will enjoy them. When I began writing for the Bridgeport Future, I made many wonderful friends. Two of those very special people were Ella Praetor and Julius Panna. Both were elderly when I met them, and they told me many wonderful stories about Bridgeport when they were younger. I would often go to Ella's house, and while she was telling me stories of yesteryear, I would feast on chocolate chip cookies and ice-cold milk. But Ella and Pa were widowed, and my mom got the idea that they should be together. We had them to dinner one evening at our house, and oh, what a wonderful time that we had. A story that was given to me by Ella Praetor and Emmett Robinson was about the electric railway. It must have really been something to see and to ride. The following is from the August 13th, 1969 edition of the Bridgeport Future and combines the stories that Ella and Emmett gave to me. On September 27, 1895, a meeting of the town board was called to grant right-of-way for an electric street railway between Saginaw, Bridgeport, and Frankenmuth. To the citizens of Bridgeport, it would ensure rapid transit to Saginaw at many different times of the day and night. Farmers might take advantage of it on cold, rainy days instead of taking their horses out in the cold and snow. There was a baggage car attached for luggage. People of Saginaw would enjoy coming out here to the country in the summertime, which many did. This would increase demand for Bridgeport property and increase population. It's really difficult in thinking about Bridgeport as being out in the country. Today, Saginaw and Bridgeport seem to just run together, but at one time, it was quite a trip to go from Saginaw out to Bridgeport. In due time, everything got underway, including leasing property to build a powerhouse and car barns to Williamson Road, to the blacksmith shop that stood on the corner of Fort Street. The powerhouse was built at the railroad on the riverbank and the barns to the east of it. Also leased was property across the road to be used as a turning table. This was a sandhill and an Indian burial ground known as Beacon Hill. It lay between Williamson and the Dixie Highway. An overpass had to be constructed over the C&O Railroad and gave everyone a thrill when they rode over it. At the west end of the viaduct was a switch that was about 3 car lengths long, extended eastward, and cars waited there until the overpass was cleared. Sometimes a car would split a switch and the car would start to make its way up the overpass and also make its way into the switch and end up almost hitting a trolley pole and tearing it to pieces underneath. At one time, they tried to lay rails on State Street near the side, but the town board would not allow it. Leonard Shreve was hired to lift the rails. He brought out a steam engine that was used in threshing time and lifted the rails in a few minutes. They found the tracks gone in the morning and never tried to put them down again. Offices for the railroad were in Clio. Trains were dispatched from there by telephone system. Telephone booths were erected at different switches along the line where motormen would call for orders. After getting a franchise, the cars ran into downtown Saginaw. A waiting room and depot was located at Federal and Franklin. Later, a third rail system was built to Bay City, but only on limited cars. The motormen would change at Flint, then they would have to drive to his own territory. On Saturdays and Sundays, travel was the heaviest, and a second car was in order. Sometimes a third car had to be put into service. A rail was laid to Frankenmuth, and cars ran between there and the junction of the Dixie Highway. Passengers would change cars if they wanted to go to Saginaw or Flint. The fare to Saginaw was 18 cents for a very long time, but later raised to 21 cents. The first car left the barn at 6:20 a.m. to accommodate those who had to be to work early in Saginaw. The last car to Saginaw was at 11:10 p.m. There were not many automobiles at that time, but in a few years they multiplied greatly, and in a short time the railway became a thing of the past. The waiting room for the electric railway was also located where Gobine's service station is now, and was run by Mr. and Mrs. Julius Neverley from 1920 to 1925. It consisted of an ice cream parlor and a pool room. Outside was a coal bin, and when the Interurban came in on a cold day, it would fill its little coal stoves to heat the inside of the car. At the waiting room, they also sold tickets to Frankenmuth, Bay City, Flint, Saginaw, and Detroit. The waiting room was located again, as I said, where Gobine Station is today. The following is a quote from Emmett Robinson's Bridgeport Lore. He wrote in discussing this many years later with him that a Saginaw attorney friend told a kindred story. He said when he was a young lawyer, an interurban railway car struck and killed a farmer's cow. This happened from time to time. The Bridgeport Court was then located on the second floor of the Crouse Saloon. Now that's where the Rite Aid store is currently. The attorney told me my boss told me to get to Bridgeport and defend the Interurban Company. He also told me that I would lose the case, but after the trial I was to take the jury downstairs and buy them all they wanted to drink. The same attorney told him that the Interurban Company never lost another damage suit in Bridgeport after that. The Bridgeport Court was held on the second floor of the Crouse Saloon. Now I mentioned a little bit ago that an overpass or viaduct was built on Beacon Hill, an Indian burial mound whose demise must be lamented. There was a poem written about the hill, which was published in August 1969 in the Bridgeport Future. The poem was written by Burton Andrus in the 1830s, and he based his account on stories told him by Indians who had received the story, generation after generation, by oral tradition. So now, even though I'm not a great dramatic reader, I will read to you The Battle of Beacon Hill by Burton Andrus. As I read, remember, this battle took place right where you walk and do business every day. Did Okanora fight and fall on Beacon Hill, and is that all? Nor said of them what time or where, who made their mausoleum there. 'Twas midnight and the watch was set, the guard a watchful vigil kept. The fire had died, the night was chill, the moon had set, and all was still. 4 stands around, their shadows deep, thrown o'er the hill, all seemed asleep. The watch stood by, the night was dark, the beacon embers, only a spark. The midnight there, all dark and still, with beacon fires round the hill. The watch his war whoops fiercely cries, 3 arrows pierce him, and he dies. In light around, without a screen, the Huron braves were plainly seen, and from out rude forms there quickly arose, and 2,000 braves rushed on their foes. The Hurons shout, the Tawas scream, the spears and knives and axes gleam. All night the conflict rages on, with hundreds dead and wounded shrieks. The Tawas flank, to boats they run, the Hurons in the stream they plunge. The spearmen strike, and in the waves 2,000 Hurons found their graves. The remnant on the southern bank pursued their foe in broken rank, who fled with many scars and fears, and never came back for many years. The oldest braves still will say 2,000 Hurons fell that day. The Tawas lost their old chief gray, the eagle of the northern bay. Great fight, great chief, time long and slow. Now sun go down, we go. On April 21st, 1971, my last article for the Bridgeport Future was published. It was also about the interurban, but of a curse that some people felt was on it, an Indian curse for the desecration of their sacred burial mound. As I already stated, in order to construct the electric railway through Bridgeport, the company had to cart away the large burial mound, named Beacon Hill. The company took the sand which made up the hill, the skeletons of the dead, and many artifacts left as grave goods, and they used them in ballasting the tracks. This ancient shrine was destroyed. Are the spirits of the long-dead chiefs at rest? What caused so many of the train cars to be thrown from the tracks, resulting in the deaths of many people? Was it angry supernatural justice that bankrupted the company? Only the restless spirits that lurk in the dark shadows of the night know that for sure. Let's go back a bit to the beginning. The village was first called Cass Bend, while the area near the Frankenmuth Junction was known as Cass Bridge. Cass Bridge was originally to be the village seat. Mr. Lull, who decided to settle at Cass Bend, built a hotel there. He wanted that to be the village seat, and this became Bridgeport, where it is today. On January 6, 1847, a bridge was built at Cass Bend for a grand total of $3,700. By the way, the building of this bridge was approved by Michigan's first governor, Stephen T. Mason. April 4, 1848 is the key date in Bridgeport history, for it was on that date the first township elections were held. The polls were at a log house owned by Noah Beach Sr., and the ballot box used on that occasion was a small red hand box that was an heirloom of the Andrus family. The box, now in the collection of the Bridgeport Historical Society, bears the mark G89, which means 1789, when the box came to America. July 12, 1801 is also inscribed in the box, and that's the date it came into the possession of Burton Andrus, who, by the way, wrote the poem I just read, The Battle of Beacon Hill. There were 40 voters at the time of the first election. 2 years before, there were 15 voters who were taken by wagon in order to vote in the Saginaw Township elections. The first officers for the new township were Noah Beach, supervisor, William Piper, treasurer, Burton Andrus, clerk, J.A. Kent, highway commissioner. Also elected at that time to fill the offices of the Justice of the Peace were William Ellis and Hatton Beach. Thus Bridgeport came to be, and at this period in her history was putting out some of the finest cork pine to be found anywhere. Like Saginaw, Bridgeport had its share of lumber mills. The first of these mills was located where the lamplighter stands today. Lumber was not the only important industry in the community at that time. There was also a grist mill, a cider mill, a shingle mill. These enterprises thrived right through the 1880s. Another thriving industry of the 1880s was the Bridgeport Brickyard, operated by James Eddington. This business employed around 20 men. The yard was located where Bridgeport Country Club is presently, and bricks for it were sold for both private and commercial use. The brickyard employed lumberjacks who were out of work when the spring drive ended. They would work at the brickyard through the summer, and then return to the lumber camps during the fall each year. R.A. Campeau was the first white man to settle in Bridgeport, and he also built the first log house in the township. The second was constructed by a Mr. Camberell in 1836. John Biddlecombe bought the first land. Eliza Miller was the first American pioneer. William Ellis and Matilda Lisa were the first couple married in Bridgeport in 1846. Henry Campeau was the first white child born in the township, and the first deaths were that of his mother and father, R.A. Campeau. The first schoolhouse, which was of logs, by the way, was built on property owned by Noah Beach. One of the early teachers was Ellen Blakely, who, believe it or not, received a total of $2 a week for her services. In 1881, the first murder of a white man was committed in Bridgeport on the Blodgett farm. A horse thief and general outlaw, William B. Clark, whose real name was Chisholm, shot and killed Sheriff Deputy Deneen. Clark was caught and tried, and he was sentenced to 15 years in the state prison. In 1884, remnants were found of what is perhaps Bridgeport's earliest resident. A mastodon was unearthed by a ditch digger. Among the bones were several well-preserved teeth, weighing over 4 pounds each. Now I'm going to tell you of one of the weirdest events I found recorded in Bridgeport in Saginaw County history. It's called the Black Day, and it took place on November 8, 1819. See, on that day, something happened to make people's hair stand on end. Early on this morning, green clouds began to thicken to an inky blackness, and by noon, it became as black as night, and the rains came pouring down, making a grayish foam as it hit the earth. The water that came down looked like soap suds, leaving a soapy deposit over everything. By late noon, there came a little clearing, but soon the clouds began to thicken once again, and then, with a blast of lightning, the clouds opened up, showing a fiery furnace. The opening is said to have lasted around 1 hour, and thunder rolled continuously, shaking the territory all around. Within a month after this, the Indians signed a treaty with Governor Cass, selling their lands. They looked upon those curious events as anger of what the Great Spirit was showing them for their misdeed in selling the land. And really, who can say now what occurred? Now, as the Industrial Revolution came along, Bridgeport was not left behind in its wake. Actually, some of the recordings you're listening to on here today, in the background, are Edison's cylinder recordings from the era of the 1890s, early 1900s. But one of the most interesting stories that I came across when I was researching the history of Bridgeport was called The First Telephone. And originally this article was published in the Bridgeport Examiner of April 4th, 1940. And I read it as it was written at that time by Ira W. Terry. And he wrote, "It was an intensely interesting sight to see linemen climb poles, affix brackets and glass insulators, then bind copper wire to place. A crowd gathered at Dr. Benjamin's store, which housed the post office, filling it to overflowing. Each person minutely examined the large, heavy, book-like apparatus with its storage batteries and jars and its handle with which to make and break an electric current and cause a bell to ring at a distance. Considerable voice volume was necessary, and there was a world of sputtering and aggravating noises, preventing a clear understanding of what words were spoken. There was plenty of conjectures and misgivings on the part of the gathering, and it was not long before a bet was offered by Lily Cook. That telephone would not work. It does work, emphatically replied Dr. Benjamin. You've got to prove it to me, replied Lily. And Dr. Benjamin scratched his head, and an instant later asked whether Pinky Hayes had left yet for Saginaw. Anxious to get about everything in this world, I exclaimed, yes, he left about 30 minutes ago. He was driving a single horse and 8 rig and passed me as I left the Whitney house, wherein we had lived for a considerable time. Well, I'll tell you what I'll do, Lily. You listen while I phone Baumgartner's store in Saginaw and ask them to wrap up whatever you can select. Write Pinky Hayes and your name on the package and place it in the wagon. If Pinky brings the stuff home, when he returns, you're to pay me 25 cents. If he fails to have the goods, then I'll pay you 25 cents. Agreed, said Lily in a loud voice. The 2 25-cent pieces were placed in a cigar box and put on a shelf back of the counter. Then a crowd talked and milled around while linemen called Central and other points to make sure the apparatus was in working order. Pinky Hayes returned about 4:30 p.m., his horse leisurely walking along the plank road. When he reached a point opposite the Robinson residence, his attention was attracted to a crowd of persons walking toward him and several shouting, "Hey, Pinky, have you got a pair of shoes for Lily in your wagon?" Pinky stopped his horse and calmly answered, "Yes, there's a pair of shoes here for Lily Cook from Baumgartner's store." Lily paid the bet. Absolute proof had been given to him of the workability of the new machine, and the world was so quickly to enter into a new state of being, sweeping Bridgeport along in its vortex. I spoke early on this CD about a man named Julius Panna. He was an outstanding person, and one who I wrote an article about, which appeared in August 20th, 1969, the Bridgeport Future. I would like to read that story to you, because he has truly a unique and wonderful place in Bridgeport history. I wrote, Panna, as we have all come to know him, was born on February 13th, 1883 in Austria, and he was raised in Vienna. He attended school in Vienna, and later he learned tool-making in a Vienna factory. He also attended a college called the Imperial Tech. He met his wife while he was in Vienna, and they came to the United States in 1907 and were married in 1908. When Pa arrived here, he went far in our bigger factories. He was a tool designer and later a general foreman. As time went on, Pa had to quit the factory because of bad nerves. In 1920, he started his own business in Bridgeport. It was called Neverly's General Store, the very biggest at that time. He also ran a garage where the Standard Oil Station is now Gobines, and Pa says he still owns that property. Altogether, he was in business for 25 years. He operated, with his wife, the Interurban waiting room at that same site. Pa had a wonderful helper, his wife. She helped to operate the general store. Bridgeport families remember her for the credit she extended during the Depression days of the 1930s. Much of it was not credit, but outright gifts. Some of her family tell how in recent years she prepared nearly 300 bundles of clothing and sent them to needy children in Europe. The letters of thanks that she received were her cherished possessions. Sadly, Mrs. Neighborly died on April 2, 1949. The cause was indeed very tragic. One day when she was home alone, she ran to put out a grass fire which threatened her home site. She was found dead of a heart attack in her farmyard by neighbors who came to help put out the fire. Pa Neighborly, at the time I wrote this article, was the oldest member of the Bridgeport Community Church, and he had attended the church for 50 years. The memorial service was written by Reverend Kitley, but was delivered by our own, for the new church, was delivered by our own Pa. The dedication service at the church was given by Pa last May of 1969. I came to know Pa for the very first time at my historical display at the Old Flower Box. He spent many hours there with me and told me many wonderful stories of his younger life. I also told you in the beginning about a very special elderly lady who was my very dear and close friend, and her name was Ella Praetor. Now, Ella was married to Walter John Praetor, who passed away in 1962. Mr. Praetor was born on April 2, 1886 in Buena Vista, where he attended school. His first exciting job was with the Interurban. I told you about that a little while ago. He worked there until it left Saginaw. He married Ella Vanek on September 19, 1906. Mrs. Praetor came here from Saginaw in 1904 and has belonged to the OES Bridgeport chapter for 60 years, and she has been the past matron for 50 years. She is also a member of the Bridgeport Community Church and very active member of the Ladies' Aid. I have known Ella Praetor for quite a while, and she is one of the most wonderful people I have had the pleasure of meeting. That was written and printed on August 27, 1969, along with another brief story about Peter Willocks, who was an outstanding Bridgeport citizen also. And it's hard for me to know where to start with Peter. It is on a younger note that he started a newspaper in Bridgeport during the 1940s called the Bridgeporter.